Welcome to the Foundry Gallery. I'm Kathryn Mohrman, a member of the gallery. Our current exhibit, our current solo show, presents the work of Fran Abrams. It's entitled 20 Years of Polymer Clay Art. It runs from September 2 to September 27. I'm pleased to have Fran here with me on Zoom to talk about her work. Hi, Fran.
Hi, thank you, Kathryn.
Fran works in a special medium, polymer clay, and she's going to explain to us what it is that she does to create her paintings and sculptures. I'd like to begin by showing you a few of Fran's works to give you a taste of what's coming. So just a moment, let me share my screen. Now, this is one of her early pieces, and you can see that it has some three-dimensionality to it. This is another one entitled Amber Waves of Grain. A third called Some Assembly Required. This one is of quite an early work of hers. It's more one-dimensional than, or two-dimensional rather than some of her other things. This purple one is really a lot of fun, called Some Assembly Required.
Actually, that one was When I Am an Old Woman.
Okay, When You Are an Old Woman. Oh my gosh, that looks pretty lively.
I will wear purple.
Oh, that's right. Yes, that famous saying. And this one is called Swimming Hole. So let's go back to Fran and find out a little more about how she got started in this and what in fact it is that she is doing.
Okay.
All right. So Fran, how did you get started in polymer clay? Most artists don't do polymer clay.
Well, there are actually many, many thousands of people across the world that work with polymer clay, but many, many of them make jewelry and sculptures and figurines. But when I went looking for something to do at the tender age of 55, when my children had left home for college and I decided it was time to do something for me, I went looking for something that I could do that was both colorful and three-dimensional. I didn't know what that was, but I happened to be walking through a craft store and came upon this material, which is polymer clay. This happens to be called Primo, that's the brand. And I also picked up a book about it, and I started reading the book and I started experimenting with it. It really wasn't doing anything for me because essentially it was instructions on how to make beads and a few other crafty projects. And I wanted to paint. So I played around with it. And then one day I was at Barnes & Noble in Rockville, and there was a community art room, and on the walls were images by an artist named Carol Ziliakis. And the images looked like kimonos. They looked like fabric that had been cut into the shape of kimonos with a cummerbund on them. They were framed, they were under glass, and I went, what? They were polymer clay. And I went, that's what I want to do. That's it. I want to do paintings with polymer clay. So her phone number was on, this was 2000. We weren't emailing those days. Her phone number was on the wall and it said she gave lessons in her home. So I called her and I studied with her for 2 years. And that is how I got into it. She teaches a technique called the Tapestry Technique, which I will tell you a little something about after we see some more of the images. But essentially, these clays mix as if they're paint, which makes it a whole lot of fun. And they mix using a pasta machine. So
really, a pasta machine?
So I thought I was getting into something that wouldn't require too much equipment. Little did I know that everything in the kitchen sink can be used with polymer clay. You can texture it, you'll see, you've seen some of what I can do with it. And there are artists all over the world, and very few of them are doing the same thing. They're all doing different things. So this is my thing. So once you have this block of clay, you slice it so that you can get it through a pasta machine. And you condition it in the pasta machine, and it turns into something that looks like this. And then I didn't invent this. I simply learned everything I could. The colors, to blend the colors, you essentially create something that looks like this. This is called a Skinner blend. It was invented by a woman named Judith Skinner, and anyone who works with clay knows this technique. So what happens when you roll that through the pasta machine a few times is that you end up getting this, which essentially has blended the clay from the yellow all the way to the blue with the greens in between. If I kept going with this, it would be a smoother blend. You wouldn't see the individual lines, but I thought it was more interesting to look at this way so that you can see how it's starting to change over time, the more times I put it through the pasta machine. So this is kind of the crux of what happens with polymer clay, is that it mixes and you essentially go from there. So let's look at some more of the work, and then I'll tell you a little more about it. But that's the basis of the work that I do. And it comes in a whole variety of colors, but I rarely use these colors out of the package. It's just as you probably wouldn't use the color that comes out of a tube of paint, you would mix it with something. I'm always mixing these to see, and it's not just these, there's many, 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 many colors. The funny part about this that just tickles me is that some of the colors have artist names to them. So this is cobalt blue. And then there's the colors. This is called sunshine. So it's really a cross between art and craft, and the names of the colors are just random. It's funny to try and see what you get when you mix sunshine with cobalt blue. It just seems they don't go together, but they do. That's the fun.
Okay, well, let's look at more carefully at some of your work, and then you can describe to us what you do. I really appreciate your showing us these things that look almost a little bit like a sheet of leather.
Yes.
And then
I describe it as feeling like American cheese. So
okay.
you get that.
Yeah.
Sense.
And then you cut it up. You cut different shapes to make the design.
You can cut it. You can layer it. There's a whole variety of things. You can roll it into canes. Many polymer artists use canes where it's been rolled and sliced.
Oh, okay.
You can combine colors and roll them into beads. There's all kinds. This gives you an idea of some of the kinds of things that I do with it.
Oh, yeah, that's helpful. Now that we've seen what it started with, you realize how much work it takes to get to the end product.
Exactly. It's very work intensive. There's no question.
Okay, well, let's look at some of the specifics, your specific examples, because I think people would enjoy seeing the end result now that we know just a tiny bit about the starting point. So let me share my screen again. This is what I want. This is different. Okay, so here are some of Fran's earlier pieces. Fran, tell us sort of, now that you've showed us it, but they don't look alike. So what kinds of things are you doing in this earlier work?
Well, first of all, in the earlier work, I was trying to create work that, first of all, the first long one and the small one at the top, I was trying to create work that looked like paintings. These are framed under glass, again, like paintings, because that's where my brain was going at that point. And so these are, the work on the upper right was a matter of putting clay together, rolling it through the machine and going, okay, I like that. Very unsophisticated. The work on the left, believe it or not, has been cut out and other pieces put in. But what I did here was to create two completely different sheets of clay. And then what I cut and what I put back in are from two different pieces of clay. So the striped pieces or the textured pieces are from a completely different sheet of clay, and then they're put together and burnished. The other beautiful thing about the clay is that once you have cut something out of it, put something back in, and burnished it, it becomes a solid sheet of clay again. So that's the other fun part, is that you can do this over and over again, and you'll end up back with a solid sheet of clay, which can then be put like this in a frame. The piece in the lower right was my realization that this was actually a very three-dimensional medium, and that working with it flat was probably in some ways a disservice to the medium. So I started experimenting with making small sculptural pieces. This one, although it doesn't show up well in this photo, is actually in a shadow box. So this has considerable depth to it. The frame has depth to it. The frame is actually about 3 inches deep. And, excuse me, the piece itself is then glued onto acid-free mat and framed in this fashion. So that was my first attempt at going into the three-dimensional realm of this material.
That's really interesting and looks totally different from either of the other two.
That's right. Well, again, the material is infinite in what you can do with it. And I was just going wherever my brain took me. You'll see also that this piece has two sides to it. So this piece has been rolled through the pasta machine with gold clay on the back of it. Once it's been rolled together, the two pieces are adhered to one another. So when I rolled it, you can see both the front and the back side of it.
And so you just twisted it to make the little bow shape.
That's right. Just like you would take a piece of fabric and just twist it, put it in the oven. Polymer clay bakes at 265 degrees. Once it's twisted like this, it will never come apart again. So it's baked, it's done.
Now, you mentioned that your first teacher taught you the tapestry technique.
Yes.
You should look at some of those.
Right. So the one in the middle, the purple one, is actually a very early one where I was literally experimenting with how you could fold the clay. So you can see the various, if you look closely, you can see that each piece is made up of sheets that have been cut and put back together again with the purple and the blue and the yellow. And then in order to, even though this piece is 16 by 16 inches, in order to bake it in a toaster oven, which is where I bake my work, I had to cut it into pieces I could manipulate and bake in an oven. So that's how I came upon this idea of putting it in squares and geometric forms. And then it is glued onto canvas that has been covered with fabric, which you can see more clearly in the piece on the left and the right, where you can actually see some of the fabric coming through. So the piece on the left and the right are actually very current pieces. They were created while I was and am staying at home during the pandemic. Fortunately, my studio is in my house. The piece on the right is 8 by 8, which means it's small enough to bake all at one time in the oven. And so the entire piece was created at one time, not cut into squares and baked. On the left, this is a larger piece, and so it is baked in sections. You can see the sections, the strips, and it is baked with a rod, a wooden dowel, through the rolled pieces, which holds its shape while it bakes. So because it only bakes at 265, you can put wood in there with the clay to add to create the shape, and you can use paper to create the shape. So in the case of the one on the right, it was all free form. I just folded it, put it in there, it baked. Same with the purple one. But with this one, because I wanted nice straight scrolls, if you will, I baked it over dowels. And then after it was baked, I pulled the dowels out and it stays just like that. So it's, as I say, infinite possibilities.
So Fran, in the center one, how big are those little squares that you've put together, almost like a mosaic?
Yes, they are. They're probably 2 inches by 2 inches.
And the whole piece is about how big?
It's 16 by 16 or possibly 18 by 18. I don't recall.
Okay, so quite a bit larger than the most current one on the right.
Correct. That's correct. So you can't tell the size, obviously, by looking at them on the screen.
No, that's why I wanted to find out, because
Yes.
it seemed much more complex with all the different little
It is.
squares and
It's-
colors.
So I rarely use squares smaller than 2 by 2, although they may be 1 by 1. I'd have to, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. They're probably larger because it's the whole idea of cutting a square. And when we go back, and I'll show you the knife I use. It's a scalpel.
So you're
So
a dangerous woman.
yes, oh yes, to myself as well. We've seen blood. But the point is that the idea is to make them actual squares so that when you lay them next to each other, they're not cockeyed. So there is a challenge there.
Okay, but you haven't just done this. You've done a number of different styles. So let's look at some more. Boy, this is different.
This is really one of my favorite things to do. I started doing these because I arrived at some pieces of clay, and essentially they come off the pasta machine as a sheet of clay, and then I can cut them into the squares that I want. And then I got to the point where I said, boy, I like these so much, I don't want to cut them. So what would I do with them if I didn't cut them? And I got to thinking and decided to try making them into a sculpture in and of themselves. And that's how these came to be. Now, the one on the right has an actual infrastructure underneath. You might call it a bracelet. If you saw it sitting by itself, you would think it's a bracelet. But in fact, it's a piece of clay that's been baked in the shape of a bracelet. And then the clay, the raw clay that was the sheet, was laid over it and it was baked again. So one of the things about the clay is that you can bake it over and over again. And some techniques require that you do that. So in this case, it's been baked twice. The piece on the left is actually being supported, or was supported while it was baked, with pieces of paper towel roll. So the cardboard rolls I cut into different lengths and use them as the prop to keep the clay up while it's being baked, and then remove them after it's baked, and it stays just the way it is.
And how long does it take to bake something like that?
It takes 35 minutes usually,
yeah.
unless it's particularly thick or heavy. I usually bake them 35 to 40 minutes.
But it's not like pottery, which takes 8 hours or something.
That's correct. It is not. So, but it's still, when you think about, for example, the purple piece and the number of pieces, so maybe I could bake 10 of them at one time and then bake the next 10. So a large piece like that is very time consuming, not only as far as making the squares, but also baking them in batches.
Well, and then you have to figure out what order you want to arrange them.
That's right. And I do that after everything is baked. And I look at them and I organize them and I arrange them. And the piece really doesn't get totally designed until that moment. And then I usually leave it sit for a while so that I can look at it again and decide if that's really what I want or if I want to make changes. And I almost always bake more than I need. So that
make more squares than you need.
Correct. So that if I am not happy with the way something is working, I can fill in something else. Now,
let's
it's very difficult. It's very difficult to get back to exactly what I did before. Part of what I love about the clay is that it's unpredictable. So while I know what colors I'm going to get out of the combinations, I can't predict exactly where each color is going to land. So trying to do that same arrangement later simply won't work.
Well, here's a totally different kind. It's Mokume Gane. What is that?
This is a wonderful technique. Again, I didn't create it. I simply learned it from other wonderful artists. It involves taking layers of clay, compressing them, and then impressing them with a cutter or any kind of tool that leaves a mark, and then reshaping it back into a cube, and then taking slices off of it. And the slices then show where one color has been forced down into the next color. So for example, the piece on the left was black, white, pink, and blue, which sounds like a very strange combination, but the idea was, this is called Coral Sky. And the idea was to create the sense of sunset. And this is what happened. Again, I knew what the effect was going to be. I could not have predicted any one particular design coming from it. And so I made many more squares than this, and then arranged them the way I wanted them, so that I got this effect of the coral sky. The piece in the center is called Summer Afternoon. It is, for example, the piece on the left, I believe, is either 10 by 10 or 12 by 12. Piece in the middle, which looks larger, is actually 8 by 8. So it works at any size. And again, it's the white, which in this case is not white, but is a color called pearl, which is very shiny. And then the blue and the green. And again, I'm experimenting with the colors. You can see the marks where I've impressed an oval form into it, and then I usually have knitting needles on hand or something else that if you can see in the upper left, it looks like there's a jagged edge there. That's actually a blade that's wavy, and that's been impressed into it.
Oh.
So after all those impressions are made, it's very distorted. So then I, again, shape it back. It's very malleable. Shape it back into a square. And one of the reasons that that these are in squares is because usually I'm working with a block that's no more than about 2 inches by 2 inches. So I'm layering it, I'm impressing it, I'm slicing it, and what I get are 2 inch by 2 inch squares. So these then are squares. Now the other thing that happens is that if you can use the pasta machine because it has different thicknesses. So if I take a thick slice, I can run it through the pasta machine, and it will then become a thin slice by using a different setting. So some of these have been thinned, and that opens up the spaces in between the colors. And that's why you can see the jagged blade line, and you can see the cutters, because thinning it has made it open up and shows more of the designs. And the piece on the lower right is based on some work by another artist in New Mexico who essentially put together a tutorial called Controlled Chaos. And it was her idea to take the lines and make them very organized, and therefore to come up with a design that could be something that you were actually aiming for. And so this is a very organic design. It uses a knitting needle to lay in the lines, and the outcome looks like leaves. So this piece is called Hints of Autumn. So it's, again, even this one technique is very versatile. And what happens is that over time, I return again and again to my favorite techniques. And the Tapestry Technique and the Mokume Gane are right up there at the top.
And that Mokume Gane is not a term I'm familiar with.
No, it is
meaning?
an adaptation from a Japanese metalworking technique.
Oh,
and many, many techniques that are used in polymer are adapted from other mediums. So for example, many artists use canes in their polymer work, and most of us are familiar with canes from glass work. So there's a lot of overlap, but of course, you can take the technique and take it in many different directions. Certainly with all the colors available in polymer, Mokume Gane goes in many different directions.
And it sounds like you can predict even less well in this technique what your outcome is going to look like.
That's correct. It really is a matter of learning over time how certain impressions are going to react. So I would say that when I did the one on the left, it was totally unpredictable. When I did the one in the middle, I had a much better idea of what was going to happen, just from experience.
I guess that's probably true of just about everything. You can
Right.
predict better, but yeah, but it must be really fun to take these
Oh, it
things out
is.
of the oven and see what you've got.
Well, you see it long before it goes in the oven, because whatever goes in is what comes out. There's no, unless it's been overcooked, in which case it's a disaster anyway. But whatever goes in looks exactly like what comes out. There's no color distortion in the oven.
Okay. Now, boy, these looks really different. Tell me about these.
Well, I have been, of course, as you can tell, fascinated by the color. And the colors of the clay, as I said, mix like paint. So one of the things you can do is essentially make a formula that says 2 parts this plus 1 part that is this color, or 4 parts this and 2 parts. You can repeat the colors over and over again simply by creating a recipe and following it every time. And by parts, I usually roll out a sheet and then use a cutter, and I call that cutter 1 part. And if I use the cutter 3 times, that's 3 parts. So I can do it small or large, or make great quantities of it, or small quantities of it. And so what I've done here is to create what I call progressions. So the piece on the left is a very simple progression from darks to lights, lights to darks, whichever way you want to call it, with a very simple orange peach background. The one on the right has 3 variables. One is the color of the arch. This piece is called bridges. The other is the color of the blue under the arch, and the other is the size of the arch. So these 3 things are moving at different rates through this piece, and it's literally an expression of what you can do with the colors of the clay by mixing them in different proportions.
Mm-hmm. And the one on the left, are you going from light to dark on each of those rows? Is that what we're seeing?
Yes. So I actually worked on it dark to light because it's a little bit easier that way. You start with the original color, you add a little bit of white, then you add more white, then you add more white.
Oh, okay.
Then
But the way you've arranged them are
right.
progression in the hue.
Right. Well, this
saturation, or whatever you want to call it.
Correct.
Very interesting. And here we've really got something different.
Well, one day I had the opportunity to go to New Orleans and walk through the sculpture garden. If you ever have the chance, you must do it. The New Orleans Museum of Art sculpture garden is just wonderful. And I looked at all of these 6 foot tall, 8 foot tall, and much taller pieces of sculpture, and I said, I wonder if I can do that on a smaller scale with my polymer. So I came home and I started working on it. And what you see here are pieces that have been created flat and then put together. And they are held together with pegs and glue. So each piece, for example, the curve that you see, or it's clearer in the triangles, is made up of the clay that's run through the pasta machine on the thickest setting. And then there are 3 or 4 layers of the clay to make a strip. And then the strip, in the case of the one on the left, is curved. Sometimes I curve it around a curved shape, for example, a cardboard tube. And sometimes I just curve it and let it be. And then I poke a hole in it before I bake it to make sure there's a place for the peg. So the beads that connect it are beads that I have rolled myself by hand, and again, poked a hole in them so that when they, except the one on top where the hole only goes part way through so that it doesn't show at the top. And then there's a peg that goes straight through and holds all of this together. And the one on the right, of course, was much more complex, much more fun to get all the holes and all the beads in the right place. So this essentially is a challenge to see if I can make the piece stand up when it's all done.
I was wondering about that.
So sometimes it doesn't work, and sometimes I go back and add something to it to add weight on one side or another. But for the most part, I have a background in art and architecture, and as part of my architecture classes, I took some engineering. So I have a sense of what might balance, and I just experiment. As my very first teacher told me, it's only clay. If it doesn't work, you're allowed to throw it away. So I always keep that in mind. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work, and I go on and try again. So I actually have some sculptures that have been made more than once with adjustments in them to make sure that they are in fact going to stand. But this is a really fun thing because, as I say, each of the pieces can and is baked flat and then put together, and the pegs need to go where the pegs need to go to make sure that it all holds together and it all balances. So this is something quite new, and I'm really enjoying it.
Well, this is really interesting. Thank you so much for showing us these different.
You're so welcome.
These different pieces. So, where do you get your inspiration? I mean, to decide what colors to use, what shapes to sort of put together, and so forth?
Well, most of the time it's just one big experiment. Oftentimes I'm intrigued by the colors. For example, the Primo people just came out with some brand new colors. That's like a gift, even though I paid for it, of course. But the point is I have new colors to experiment with and see how they're going to mix with the other colors. And sometimes it's simply something else I've looked at and thought, oh, I really like those colors together. Or it could be, for example, the summer afternoon piece. I went, how would you convey a summer afternoon? Just this wonderful sense of lightness. So it can be an inspiration from nature. It can be an inspiration from the clay itself. So, for example, the piece that this came from, and again, this goes to making more than you need. This comes from a piece called Abstract Influences. And I didn't like it when it came out. So I set it aside and made another one. But it gives you an idea. But these colors, I wanted to see how they work together. And clearly, I really loved how they came out. So that they were the inspiration. And then this again, this piece is part of a piece that was called Lemon Tree. So the colors were setting the mood. And it's just a question of what can I do today that I haven't done before.
So do you start with the title or do you start with the color?
I usually start with the color, and then as it works its way along, it tells me what it wants to be. So it'll in some way communicate, and I'll say, oh, this is going to be apples or lemon tree or whatever. This is what it's going to be. Now the progressions pieces again are strictly color studies. That's really what they are.
Yeah.
But the pieces that involve either Mokume Gane or the Tapestry Technique start off inspired by colors. And I always mix the colors first to see what they're going to do to each other. So I don't just sit down with big sheets of clay and start mixing and cutting. I take small sheets and give myself a sample so I know what they're going to do. And if I don't like it, I don't go any further. So I might have mixed something that when you look at it, it goes, that looks sort of brown. It wasn't what I was going for. So set that aside, let's try a different combination. So it's not like it's all perfect all the time, but it sure is a lot of fun to experiment.
So when you have you've rolled it out to make the thickness you want, then do you like cut circles and rearrange them, or exactly how do you get some of these complex designs?
Well, this is an attempt to show you that. The bottom piece has only had the circles cut out and replaced. So first I go through the sheet and cut the circles or the shapes with a cutter like this. This is a lovely invention. It's a nylon cutter, so it has no seams, so that you don't get a catch where the seam is. And they come in all different shapes.
Oh, okay.
So, and then, so after the sheet is made, I cut out the shapes and put it, and then replace them. So you can see this certainly didn't come from that location. I placed it in that location. And then I use a burnisher, which requires a lot of elbow grease. And then what you see up here is where the circles have been cut and burnished twice. So I go back over it 2 or 3 times. That's how the design becomes more complex.
Okay, that really helps a lot to understand.
So that you can see what's going on there. And then the shapes, as I mentioned, are cut with this blade, which you always, as an artist using this, you always remember sharp side down, because if you put the sharp side up, you end up with blood on your hands. So this is a very sharp blade, and that's what the clay gets cut with.
Uh-huh. Well, this is really fascinating because
Thank you. I enjoy talking about it.
it turns out to be very artistic, starting with something that almost could be, like glorified Play-Doh or something. So but it really leads to how your imagination puts it together.
That's exactly right. It's a very creative process, and I love it. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to be doing while staying home. It keeps me busy, and it really is very creative. Mixing the colors and deciding what designs to use with them is, I hope people will take a look at the show and see all the things that can be done with this material.
Well, that's a wonderful segue, because I wanted to encourage people to stop at the Foundry Gallery and take a look at your show. It's up between September 2 and September 27. And as I mentioned before, you can also see others of Fran's work on her website, which is franabrams.com. So thank you so much, Fran.
Thank you,
for
Kathryn.
introducing us to a really fascinating form of art that, frankly, I knew almost nothing about. So
thank you. It's my pleasure, because I love to talk about it.
Well,
many polymer clay artists refer to this as their addiction. So I understand. It's 20 years I've been working with this. It's an addiction.
But it sounds like you've always been learning new techniques, new
That's
ideas,
right.
new changes. So your creativity is always going full time.
That's right.
Well, thank you once again. And it's been an absolute delight
Thank
to
you.
talk with you.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.